In the 1970s, a new technology emerged that would change the way people consumed media. The video home system, or VHS, was a revolutionary format that allowed people to record and play back video content in the comfort of their own homes. But what many people don't know is that some of these VHS tapes hold a dark secret. Nazi marks, hidden in plain sight, have been discovered on some of these beloved tapes, leaving many to wonder how they got there and what they mean. The rise of VHS was a phenomenon that swept the nation. People were eager to get their hands on the latest technology, and VHS players quickly became a staple in many American households. But as the popularity of VHS grew, so did the demand for content. Video rental stores popped up all over the country, offering a wide range of movies and TV shows for people to rent and enjoy. Little did they know, some of these tapes would hold a sinister secret. During World War II, the Nazi regime used propaganda to spread their ideology and manipulate the masses. They produced a wide range of materials, from posters and pamphlets to films and radio broadcasts. But what many people don't know is that the Nazis also used VHS technology to disseminate their propaganda. These tapes, often marked with Nazi symbols and codes, were used to spread hate and intolerance, and some of them have been discovered in the most unlikely of places. The discovery of Nazi marks on VHS tapes was a shocking revelation. It started with a few isolated incidents, where collectors and enthusiasts stumbled upon tapes with strange symbols and codes. As more and more tapes were discovered, it became clear that this was not an isolated phenomenon. The Nazi marks were widespread, and they seemed to be hidden in plain sight. But how did they get there, and what did they mean? To understand how Nazi marks ended up on VHS tapes, we need to delve into the history of VHS technology. The first VHS players were introduced in the 1970s, and they quickly became popular. But the technology itself was not new. It had been developed in the 1950s and 1960s, and it had been used for a variety of purposes, including military and industrial applications. It's possible that the Nazis had access to this technology, and that they used it to create propaganda tapes. The Nazi connection to VHS technology is a fascinating and disturbing topic. It's clear that the Nazis were interested in using technology to spread their ideology, and VHS was just one of the many tools they used. But how did they get their hands on this technology, and how did they use it to create propaganda tapes? The answers to these questions are still unclear, but it's possible that the Nazis had a network of operatives and sympathizers who helped them to acquire and use VHS technology. The codes and symbols used by the Nazis on their VHS tapes are a fascinating topic. They used a variety of symbols, including the swastika and the SS logo, to mark their tapes and identify them as propaganda. But they also used more subtle codes, such as numerical sequences and cryptic messages, to convey their ideology and instructions to their operatives. These codes and symbols are still not fully understood, and they remain a topic of fascination and study for historians and enthusiasts. The impact of Nazi propaganda on VHS tapes is a topic of great concern. These tapes were used to spread hate and intolerance, and they had a profound impact on the people who watched them. They helped to fuel the Nazi war machine, and they contributed to the atrocities that were committed during World War II. But they also had a lasting impact on the world, shaping the course of history and influencing the way we think about propaganda and ideology today. The legacy of VHS is a complex and multifaceted topic. On the one hand, VHS technology revolutionized the way we consume media, and it paved the way for the modern entertainment industry. But on the other hand, it also played a role in the spread of Nazi propaganda, and it contributed to the atrocities of World War II. As we look back on the history of VHS, we are forced to confront the darker aspects of our past, and to consider the ways in which technology can be used for good or ill. The preservation of history is a crucial topic, especially when it comes to the legacy of VHS. As the tapes themselves begin to deteriorate, it's essential that we preserve the content and the context in which they were created. This means not only digitizing the tapes, but also documenting the history and the cultural significance of VHS technology. By doing so, we can ensure that future generations will be able to learn from the past and to understand the complex and often disturbing history of VHS. The power of propaganda is a topic that should not be underestimated. The Nazis used propaganda to great effect, spreading their ideology and manipulating the masses through a variety of media, including VHS tapes. But propaganda is not unique to the Nazis, and it continues to be used today by governments and organizations around the world. As we consider the legacy of VHS, we must also consider the ways in which propaganda can be used to shape our perceptions and influence our actions. As we continue to uncover the truth about the Nazi marks on VHS tapes, we are forced to confront the darker aspects of our past. We must consider the ways in which technology can be used for good or ill, and we must be vigilant in our efforts to preserve the truth and to prevent the spread of propaganda and hate. The story of the Nazi marks on VHS tapes is a complex and disturbing one, but it is also a reminder of the importance of understanding and preserving our history, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it may be. Long after the Second World War ended, many German factories that had produced equipment for the Nazi regime were repurposed for civilian manufacturing. The same machines, tooling, and sometimes even stamping dies remained in use. When consumer electronics began to rise in the post-war decades, some of these facilities contributed components or processes. A VHS tape or player assembled far from Germany could still carry echoes of that industrial lineage through standardized parts. The physical marks left on metal housings or internal frames were not always ideological, but they were historical. The global supply chain for electronics relied on interchangeable components built to shared specifications. A real motor, a gear, or a molded bracket might be made by a firm with roots in wartime production. These parts moved silently through distributors and assemblers. Collectors who opened vintage VHS decks sometimes found stamped codes or symbols that traced back to older European tooling. The object in a living room looked harmless, yet its smallest pieces held a paper trail. Not every mark found on old equipment was a political emblem. Many were simply manufacturer codes, batch numbers, or quality inspections. But some symbols used in the Nazi period, such as certain eagles or runic letters, were adopted by state-controlled industries. When those dies survived, the shapes could reappear without intent decades later. Understanding the difference requires careful study of context, not assumption. A mark is a clue, not a verdict. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the video home system transformed how families experienced media. The cassette was a humble plastic shell holding magnetic tape, yet it represented leisure, recording, and shared memory. To find any connection to a darker industrial past can feel jarring. The contrast between a beloved object and its distant supply chain history is part of why such discoveries capture attention. The VHS was never a political artifact by design. Hobbyists who preserve obsolete technology often document every screw and label. One such examination of a vintage deck or tape might reveal an unexpected stamp beneath a cover. These observers are not historians by training, but their archives build a record. Photographs of markings shared among enthusiasts allow patterns to emerge. What begins as curiosity becomes a small contribution to material history. Metal dies and molds are expensive to replace, so manufacturers kept them for years. A symbol cut into steel in the 1930s could still press into aluminum in the 1970s. Surface finishes and paints changed, but the underlying form did not. This quiet continuity explains how old marks reached modern objects. The passage of time did not erase the tooling, it merely distanced us from its origin. After 1945, Allied authorities and later the German government restricted the public use of Nazi insignia. New production was forbidden from displaying them. However, enforcement focused on visible consumer goods and public display, not obscure internal parts. A component inside a device sold abroad might escape scrutiny. the law shaped what was seen, but not always what was embedded. A single VHS mechanism could contain pieces from several countries. Springs from one nation, capacitors from another, and a frame from a legacy European press. International trade blurred the story of each element. When a mark surfaces, tracing it means following freight routes and corporate mergers. The beloved object in a home is the final stop of a long journey. We tend to separate treasured possessions from painful history. The VHS cassette sits in the first group for many people. Discovering industrial traces of the Nazi era complicates that comfort. Yet such findings also show how deeply the wartime economy reached into later life. An object of joy can still be a time capsule of production. Memory lives in materials as well as minds. Museums and technical archives catalog devices with unusual marks to preserve evidence. They note the model, the date, and the condition of the symbol. This quiet work prevents the past from being guessed at or exaggerated. The goal is not sensation but accuracy. A marked VHS part becomes one data point in a larger industrial record. It is easy to see a strange symbol and assume the worst. Responsible study demands comparison with known references and provenance. Many marks are benign and predate or postdate the regime entirely. The danger of false claims is that they obscure real history. A calm look at the object serves truth better than a rushed label. The VHS time capsule is not a story of conspiracy but of continuity. A beloved format for home movies was built on parts whose lineage stretched back through turbulent decades. Nazi marks, where they appear, are remnants of industry, not intent in the living room. To study them is to see how the past persists in small, physical ways. We close this part of the record with a clearer view of the object in our hands. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more real mysteries and discoveries.